This video will cover reference geometry. If parts do not contain planar or cylindrical surfaces, the assembly constraints cannot be used to constrain the parts in the assembly. Fortunately, the reference geometry of parts can be used. Click on the part and select Show Reference Geometry from the pop-up menu. You can also right-click on the part in the Design Explorer and select Show Reference Geometry. The planes and axes that were used to create that part will now appear in the assembly. This is very useful if the part you're working on does not have geometry that lends itself to the constraints. The planes and axes that were used in the creation of the part will be available and are able to be incorporated in assembly constraints. You can now use this reference geometry to place assembly constraints. Once the constraints have been satisfactorily applied, you can turn off the reference geometry so they will not be displayed on the screen and the constraints will still be active. In this example, the spring is unable to be mated or aligned using assembly constraints because the face of the spring is not planar or cylindrical. This is shown by using the measurement tool and selecting on the face of the spring. It says that the face of the spring is non-planar. To assemble the spring to the adjustment screw, you can right-click on the spring and then select Show Reference Geometry. You can also choose Show Reference Geometry from the Design Explorer. This will display the planes and axes that were used in the creation of the part. These axes and planes can be used in the assembly constraints. To mate the top of the spring to the underside of the adjustment screw, the Quick Constraint tool is started and the underside of the adjustment screw is selected. Then the spring's YZ plane is selected to create a mate constraint. By clicking on the axis of the spring and on the cylindrical surface of the adjustment screw, they are constrained together with an align constraint. The planes and planar faces can also be used to help constrain this assembly together. After the spring is constrained, the reference geometry can be hidden in the assembly, but the assembly constraints will still be fully intact. To do this, right-click on the spring and uncheck Show Reference Geometry. You could also do this in the Design Explorer by right-clicking on the spring and unchecking Show Reference Geometry. When showing reference geometry of parts in assemblies, the geometry will only show if it is shown in the part file. For example, this spring is edited within the context of the assembly. The primary axes and planes are set to Hide. When the part model is closed, the spring's reference geometry is no longer visible. This reference geometry cannot be made visible until it is once again set to visible in the part file. Also keep in mind that axes and planes must also be toggled on within the assembly workspace for any axes or planes to be visible in the assembly. This video covered reference geometry. If parts do not contain planar or cylindrical surfaces, the assembly constraints cannot be used to constrain the parts in the assembly. Fortunately, the reference geometry of parts can be used. Reference geometry can be turned on to place assembly constraints and then turned off again after the constraints have been placed.